Hello my dear friends, how are you? I'm Mari Theriger and today I'm going to talk about Nordic witchcraft and diabolism. Now, I don't want to give you false hopes or expectations, so what this video is going to be really about is the case of the changes of mentalities in relation to traditional folk magic and beliefs, as well as new conceptions and demonization of the Old Norse gods to a certain extent, in a context of post-religious transition and the impact of Catholicism and even more so of Protestantism after the European Reformation on the Scandinavian and Icelandic mentalities of the Middle Ages and modern period. Not so much in relation to the Christian religious influences upon Old Norse material, not this time, but speaking of the impact of the church and the idea of witchcraft and diabolism in Nordic societies. So this video may be rather boring to some of you, although it may prove to be useful as a brief introduction for those studying the history of witchcraft, the stereotype of the witch, the figure of the devil, the pact with the devil, goddesses of witches, and so on and so forth. A variety of themes that compose the history of witchcraft in Western Europe and the changes of mentalities and social behaviors that led to the witch hunts and witch trials. Speaking of the pact with the devil, which is a theme that I will occasionally mention throughout this video, although I am not going to focus too much on it, because I have already done a video precisely talking about the idea of the pact with the devil, which is one of the most important elements in the study of witch hunts and witchcraft in general. So for those that are not yet familiarized with the concept of the pact with the devil, please click on this information icon on your right upper corner and take a look at that video concerning the pact with the devil, just for a better understanding of the content of this video and to avoid repeating myself for your own sake. I've got you covered, fam. Now, with no more delay, let's start our today's video, my dear friends. Please. Let us then examine witchcraft and diabolism in the medieval Nordic world and early modernity, especially starting with the pact with the devil, which was a theological concept according to which those accused of witchcraft, or in other words, people who still held on to some ancient traditions and beliefs in their daily practices, well, it was believed that these people had made a contract or a pact with the devil, and from that alliance resulted in the acquisition of magical powers and abilities. So anyone who practiced magic or demonstrated an activity of any magical kind was because the person had made a pact with the devil, and was then accused of heresy and apostasy, which could lead to that person's execution. This accusation was a key component of Western conceptions of witchcraft and changed ideas about witchcraft forever. Of course, this concept has had its impact in the Nordic countries as well. However, the distribution of this accusation of making pacts with the devil in post-Reformation Scandinavia and Iceland was somewhat unbalanced, being much more common in Denmark and Sweden, but rare in the late medieval context of Norway and Iceland, with a few exceptions, of course. However, we are talking about post-Reformation periods. I must point out that traces of the idea of the pact with the devil were already in evidence in medieval Iceland, early medieval Iceland, especially in the events that took place in the convent of Kirkjuboer Abbey in 1343, where the burning of nuns and the circumstances that led to these events have strong parallels with contemporary theories of accusations of witchcraft. The burning of nuns accused of having sold their soul to the devil. They were sentenced guilty, charged of heresy, apostasy, and fornication with the devil, and executed by burning. That's why I said earlier that it's important to be aware of the concept of the pact with the devil and know its history and theological concepts, because this helps us to understand one of the most brutal and bizarre incidents in the history of medieval Iceland and other incidents likewise throughout the Nordic world. Therefore, already in medieval Nordic times, there were already some references to the pact with the devil, which was a concept that, instead of disappearing with time, only increased, especially after the Reformation, especially in the 16th and the 17th centuries in the Nordic countries, but not so much in Iceland and Norway as it had been in the Middle Ages, but rather it increased in Sweden and Denmark throughout the modern period, right? It is important to reflect on the impact that the concept of the pact with the devil has had on the Nordic religious and social mentalities, especially in Sweden, because it coincides with the colonization process of Sweden, more specifically with the colonization of the Sami peoples. Swedish colonialism had a very strong and rather negative impact on the native Sami peoples, which was already evident during the Old Norse period, when the Nordic Germanic peoples progressively occupied Sami territories in the late Iron Age, thus also leading to several important cultural syncretisms. Theological ideas about witchcraft and diabolism only augmented the racism and derogatory connotations that the peoples of southern Scandinavia had about the Sami and the Finns, which completely changed a number of Sami traditions and beliefs that influenced the Nordic Germanic peoples, and vice versa, of course. So the demonization of pre-Christian Sami beliefs was also, to a certain extent, the demonization of many Old Norse pagan concepts and beliefs that had parallels with the Sami ones, including how Seidr and magic in general was understood, which is one of the reasons that lead us to quite wrong understandings about pre-Christian traditions, beliefs, religions, and mythologies of the Nordic cultural world, as many of the studies in these areas were done post-Reformation, with a not that impartial mentality, very derogatory and always in a theological critical way, constantly repressing and deliberately distorting and the suppression of important evidences of the pre-Christian Scandinavian pagan cults and belief systems of the past. So this is part of the problem we face when dealing with late medieval sources such as Icelandic sagas, but also accounts from Scandinavia back in the continent concerning accounts in the rural areas of what seems to be lingering pagan customs and traditions. The problem here is that because much of the surviving written sources on Old Norse beliefs were written in Iceland by Christians and in a period in which the conception of the pact with the devil was quite strong and well known, we are dealing with Christian interpretations of paganisms and lingering pre-Christian pagan beliefs, and sometimes specific attributes of a pagan deity are either added or are transformed according to the Christian religious mentality of the time. And then this has had great influence on later sources and studies concerning said deity, as an example. The pact with the devil was just concerning what was happening in the time period when such a religious conception was used as proof of dealing with witchcraft and people supposedly selling their souls to the devil or making a bargain with him, with the devil. The pact with the devil also served to seek out such bargains or pacts with the devil in older sources when the idea of the pact itself wasn't even created yet. For instance, since much of the Old Norse mythological accounts were written in Iceland during the Catholic period and already in a time when the pact with the devil was well known, this religious conception and other Christian religious conceptions mingled and fused with pagan conceptions. Much later, during the Reformation period, when the pact with the devil became quite widespread and Christians, especially Protestants, were seeking evidences of the pact with the devil even in old literature, they would interpret specific accounts of Old Norse mythology as being evidences of the pact with the devil. And this has had tremendous influences on later studies of the Old Norse sources and of traditional folk magic and belief systems, to the point that some of the old Nordic gods were interpreted as the devil or having attributes understood to be evil according to the Christian mentality. And this has changed important points of pagan belief and cultic behavior and turned into a pact with the devil. Not so much as literally saying it was a pact with the devil, but the very religious conceptions around the pact not only were transported to old sources when interpreting them, but also seeking in the old sources parallels with the pact, and thus creating very erroneous interpretations. We shall see examples further ahead. We must bear in mind that when talking about European witchcraft in a late medieval and mostly modern context, we are dealing with literary sources that no longer focus on pre-Christian folk beliefs and magical traditions, but rather are dealing with the European historical witchcraft, that is, one that is intimately linked with the ideas of Christianity and the process of unification of evil and demonization. So not only we often find the presence of the devil in the acts and beliefs of witchcraft, but also the demonization of pagan entities and the use of pagan deities to reflect the concept of evil in the Christian mentality. So these literary sources deal with paganism and its deities from a Christian perspective. These sources, therefore, pointed out that the other non-Christian deities were the devil's devices to lead people astray from the true faith. So, when faced with another deity that isn't the Christian God, that deity was considered one more facet of the devil, even though originally having non-malignant characteristics. Obviously, this process did not occur with all deities, but it was something recurrent. As you might guess, much of what we think we know about some pagan deities is actually largely a Christian product. I've already exposed here on this channel the case of the goddess Diana, and their great connection to witchcraft, a pagan deity who became the scapegoat of Christianity to detect acts of witchcraft and pacts with the devil, as an example of how a pagan deity became more Christian in its characteristics rather than pagan. This process of unifying various deities within the figure of the devil, especially those that had the most evil traits in the Christian perspective, although the deities of antiquity are marked by the presence of both good and evil within them, ends up unifying the evil within the same main figure. In the case of pagan Scandinavia, we have the case of Loke, who, despite not having been a deity nor venerated as such, was one of the most appreciated spirits in the animistic perspective and called for aid within the Scandinavian context of traditional folk beliefs and magic, being an important spirit not only in the domestic environment but also of great value in agriculture and some magical practices, making Loke the most famous non-divine figure in Norse mythology, precisely for its great importance in pre-Christian folk practices and beliefs of Scandinavia. Well, this great importance of Loke meant that this spirit has been present until quite late in popular magical and animistic practices. Hence, to the very figure of Loke, many concepts of identity and Christian religious conscience were attributed to Loke, transforming Loke in another aspect of the devil. This is the most direct example of the process of unifying several deities within the figure of the devil for the case of Scandinavia. Then we have another problem. In addition to this process, there was also the demonization of deities who, when they did not become the devil himself, became their lackeys, minions, allies, or companions. That is, pagan deities or spirits who did not become a version or aspect of the devil, in the sense of being understood as a disguise of the devil to distance the pagans from the true faith, but became auxiliary beings of the devil himself, companions, helpers, allies who helped the devil to spread evil, disagreement, and lies. These processes were a very effective way to facilitate Christianization, changing the meanings of places already known to the pagans or the heathens. This generated a process of folklorization of Christianity. To prevent the now Christian sites from being destroyed, it was necessary that the ancient local meanings and religious connotations gained a symbology of fear and revulsion. The same thing happened with local deities, a process in an attempt to secure the conversion. This was something very recurrent throughout Europe and eventually the rest of the world during colonialism. Of course, this also happened in Northern Europe. Many places of pagan worship and even places attributed to specific deities and spirits became places of fear and revulsion, having connotations related to witchcraft and diabolism. So this becomes a problem when dealing with the study of specific deities. Of course, obviously. Because if we look into the places of their past worship and places connected to deities and spirits in any way, in folklore also remains the malign associations of the church, which leads us to believe that those deities and local spirits had these same malign associations, connections and characteristics to the ancient pagans, therefore distorting the understanding of the deity and how it was understood in a pre-Christian past. This fear facilitated acceptance of the new belief or the new religion, as well as serving to demonstrate the magical power of Christianity and its superiority. Conversion is nothing more than a magical and political religious dispute between the two beliefs. The allegation and attribution of fear is directly linked to the desire for salvation, since if you fear the deity you used to worship and now understand it to be wrong and evil, you fear not being saved from your sin. This in a Christian perspective. So Christianity offered salvation from venerating the wrong deities who were just the devil's disguises. Therefore, the need to demonize and to create fear is to aggrandize the effect of salvation and the capacity of salvation of Christianity, something that only the church could do, as only the Christian God could defeat the devil's great forces. The construction of fear and even of the devil is another tactic of this process. In a pagan understanding where all life and all spaces are full of spirits and deities, changing this understanding of these spirits and deities and turning them into evil beings and as aspects of the devil, it is understandable how easy it was the conversion to a religion that offers salvation from all these evil beings that are absolutely everywhere, increasing fear and sense of dread, making the former pagans only feel safe within the church itself, being the dwelling place of the very Christian deity who protects from all evil. This church being often the structure implemented on top of ancient pagan temples and places of worship. Consequently, this fear also caused people to have less contact with the natural world, and it was, as the natural world was full of evil beings now, in the Christian understanding, due to the demonization of the populations of local spirits and deities, therefore preventing people from returning to the old places of pagan belief and worship. Therefore, within this whole new religious scenery, it is here that the pact with the devil and witchcraft gained more strength as elements that provoke even more fear and revulsion. And all those accused of practicing witchcraft and or making an alliance with the devil, they were quickly persecuted and handed over to the church by the very populations who now feared ancient spirits and gods. All those who still practice some kind of traditional folk magic and who were seen in now demonized places, it was immediately understood that they would be having contact with the devil and his allies. Therefore, they would be pulling evil forces and causing harm to the Christian community. I've done a video before concerning Uti Seta, and if you have the time, you can check it right here. by clicking on this information icon in the right upper corner. On that video, you can see how Scandinavian and Icelandic laws changed in relation to old practices of witchcraft and sorcery, and how it became forbidden within the law itself, and anyone caught in the act was severely punished. Even acts such as uti seta or sitya uti, as an Old Norse practice of sitting out for meditation purposes and contemplation in order to receive knowledge from spirit entities, became forbidden, and an act of diabolism and contact with demons. It even became forbidden by law the contact with spirits because of the fear that such actions from a pagan past could open up ways or portals for the devil and his minions to come through. All folk customs, practices, beliefs, and traditions became heresy. The concept of heresy served to reinforce Christian practices to help implement its ideology. So, in very early Scandinavian and Icelandic laws, we already progressively see pagan practices becoming heresy and eventually completely forbidden. So there was a huge superposition of Christian themes, practices, and images on the corresponding pagan predecessors, creating a profound and radical change in meanings, and it is here that we come across a number of mythologies, deities, spirits, a whole set of literary and even oral sources, etc., which actually have more Christian characteristics and content than pagan ones. There was a considerable growth of heresies. The magical practices of the pagan world were meant to become heresies, which is why there are several heresies, because each locality gave a different meaning, practice, intention, and usefulness to witchcraft, or in other words, to traditional folk magic and beliefs. As such, some deities and spirits have a lot of different characteristics and behaviors, not only due to the cultural and religious syncretism between different pagan cultures through time, but also because the majority of written sources on paganism and the old gods and spirits are Christian products from a Christian mentality, turning different local approaches and practices towards gods and spirits into different heresies. The easiest way to make something heretical is to associate it with the devil. So in this way we understand how Christianity worked to meet and find what was pagan and what makes it a heresy, precisely by creating a devil-witchcraft relationship. This relationship is fundamentally linked to the Church's fight against heresy that eventually reaches Scandinavia, a geographical reality that already had a considerable amount of knowledge concerning the pact with the devil since the beginning of the contact with the Church through Denmark as early as the 6th century of the Common Era, and in the context of the Viking Age as well throughout Scandinavia. We already see, at least from the 8th and 9th centuries onwards, a great deal of motifs and Christian material culture in burials. So by the time of the witch hunts and trials, the Christian mentality was already well implemented in Scandinavia and in Iceland. So several literary and oral sources were produced and or supported by the Church and circulated in Scandinavia quite early, allowing the notion of the pact with the devil, what constituted heresy, the evil of witchcraft, and other themes to be quite well known and rooted in the region. And of course, these notions had already had a great influence on literary sources on Norse mythology. Notions of hell, of heaven, angels, God, the devil, heresy, derogatory notions towards witches and sorcerers and pagan themes can already be found within the sources related to Old Norse mythology and other themes and belief systems. Much more so in sources of the 10th century of the Common Era, with the considerable contact Scandinavians have had with Christian Anglo-Saxons, which not only also facilitated conversion, but also influenced religious material culture, which, on the other hand, also changed the mentality and religious perceptions towards the old gods. So you might imagine the extent of the derogatory implications towards pagan entities and the fear of pagan practices within the collective consciousness of populations when the real fight against heresy and the witch hunts and trials took place, especially during the 15th century onwards, and most especially when Protestantism took hold, which was far more severe between the 16th and the 17th centuries, when 80% of the victims accused of witchcraft were executed. The fear of the old gods and traditional folk magic in Scandinavia had progressively been built since the early Middle Ages. So by the time of the great witch hunts and executions, that fear and even revulsion was well rooted within the collective mentality. Therefore, obviously, understanding the amount and content of stories and tales and myths that were known in Scandinavia is fundamental for us to know and understand the meaning and the why of applying processes, penalties, and accusations of witchcraft and diabolism, especially in the modern age. So we may understand where these accusations were easily implemented in the persecution of heresy, mainly because of the way in which the Christian thinking or mentality bent over certain older writings and understood certain written sources. We have the example of Ketil Saga that demonstrates a clear example of the derogatory sense in relation to witchcraft and sorcery and the recurrent ideas concerning witchcraft, diabolism, and the figure of the witch woman. It tells us of a sorceress or a witch with her hair fluttering in the wind as traveling through the air, who is interrogated and begs not to be arrested because she was on her way to a magical assembly or a gathering in which Skelkinger, the king of spirits, witches and trolls, presided, who came from Domschaf. Although there is a certain pagan belief here, much of this small part of the saga demonstrates more Christian understanding than pagan, and the recurrent idea of the late medieval Christian world that witches fly and gather in groups or assemblies where a representative figure presides, either the devil or an aspect or ally of the devil. Domschaf in folklore precisely being associated with the witch trials as the place in the northernmost part of Scandinavia, in Finnmark, where it was believed that in here there was an entrance to hell itself, and so witches flew to these parts to meet the devil for Sabbath. This is a geographical area of the Sami people, and both the Sami and Finns are often associated to witchcraft and sorcery in a very derogatory and racist sense, already noticeable in Old Norse sources. So this racism and general intolerance towards the Sami people only augmented with Christianity, and even more so with Protestantism. I think the best example concerning this racism and general intolerance towards the Sami and the fear of their witchcraft and traditional magic practices and beliefs in Old Norse sources is precisely the account of Gunhild, considered to be the Old Norse witch. I've done a video about this subject in the past October, so if you have the time, check that video. In the figure of Gunhild, we really see both the fear and the intolerance and revulsion towards the Sami, but also towards magic, sorcery, witchcraft in general, and the fight against heresy. Even though being an Old Norse source, it's an account heavily influenced by the Christian religious mentality, and we clearly notice the repression of old customs, practices, beliefs, and of traditional folk magic. This is another example you should definitely check. Going back to Ketil Saga and that little paragraph, we come across a Christian understanding with a clear reference to the diabolical Sabbath and demonalatry in the region, as well as the negative and evil aspects of witches and their ability to fly through the air, which shows us a clear evil precept about witchcraft and sorcery. Of course, witchcraft and sorcery are different things, but from a Christian perspective, especially in religious debates, the two concepts tended to come closer, eventually merging, especially in the modern age and at the height of the witch hunt, especially in Northern Europe between 1560 and 1660. This passage from Ketil's saga, as well as other excerpts from other sources, aids in this process of manipulating magical practices. This is just one example among many. That's why it's important to understand the Christian concept of witchcraft, witches, diabolism, heresy, etc., to understand how they were understood in the Christian mentality, and therefore it becomes easier to grasp Christian religious concepts even in the oldest sources, including oral sources, to avoid creating wrong notions towards paganisms of the past. We have the example of the witch from Njol's saga and the role of women in the Volsunga saga and the Króka-Refs saga, and the clear derogatory, homophobic and misogynist sense towards women and men practitioners of Seidr, especially in Króka-Refs saga and in Njol's saga, and the gender identity of the male practitioners of Seidr seen as craven, unmanly, effeminate, and a clear intolerance towards old pagan practices, especially the surviving pagan cult of Svinafell in Iceland, mentioned in Njol's saga, among other sources that allow us to see a Christian change of certain aspects to better approach the Christian notion of witchcraft, well within the terms of the process of altering ancient meanings, shaping them to the new religious reality to facilitate conversion, as stated before. Take the example of the story of the Swedish king Erik Sigurdsjäli, as presented in the translation of Older Snorrason's late 12th century life of Olafr Tryggvason, which presents clear indications of the concept of the Pact. According to the saga, the king becomes victorious only after pledging himself to Odinar for 10 years. Odinar is the demonization of the god Odin turned into an aspect of the devil, a facet of the devil, with whom the king made a pact with. In this account, we see the distortion of a devotion towards Odin from the part of nobility, turning Odin into an aspect of the devil. You can read that for yourself. As you go through the story, you see more and more Christian religious conceptions. These religious ideas were already well established in Scandinavian societies from a very early period with contact with Christianity, including in the Viking Age, especially as early as the 6th and the 7th centuries in Denmark and the 8th and 9th centuries in Norway and Sweden. Concepts that gained more strength and were highlighted with the steady growth of the church, becoming clearer when Denmark in 1617 incorporated the pact with the devil as an accusation of witchcraft within the legal terms and law codes, further influencing the religious beliefs and the fear of witchcraft and diabolism in the territories of Sweden and Iceland that they controlled, which later led to the witch hunt during the modern age. And it is in this historical period that we find in Scandinavia a large number of processes, cases, and the representations about the pact with the devil, Sabbaths, witch rites, and witchcraft, and often the mixture of the old gods and ancient spirits, which influenced later studies regarding Scandinavian pre-Christian belief systems. Alright, my dear friends, I do hope you have enjoyed today's video. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje.